welcome you as I move over to the next panel. I'd like to just base myself upon what Alexander Arkhangelsky just said about our willingness and readiness to build the future now and look into this future. Indeed, when all of a sudden the Soviet system collapsed, it just switched out of the light and some new reality ensued that other than some specific think tanks nobody was prepared for. Nowadays, the wheel is coming full circle, the wheel of history. It may look a vicious circle sometimes, but this way or other we find ourselves at a time when you have to look forward and think about what would come next. Nowadays we've all become more flexible. And if this future should come, we can, right now, we are better prepared because we know more and better than those who in the early 1980s tried to look into this future and contemplate it in some way or other. Nowadays we do know something, we do have some experience. But this experience, how and what it has embodied in, what are we prepared for today, where today we see these most important categories of solidarity, social awareness, public spirit, civics. This is exactly, these words were non-existent. We discussed the words in the 1980s too. This is what we are going to discuss today at this panel. We have 2 hours to go. Let's make long presentations. Let's leave room for Q&A, because again, it makes no difference. It's all the same panel, including our people on the floor. So may I introduce our distinguished speakers today? Just a moment, please. Give me a moment. Barbara von Freytag is a journalist, a political scientist, an expert on Russian civil society. Today she is working in Prague, in a center in Prague. Ambassador Frances O'Donnell is a life member of the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin, under the auspices of the President of the country. Lena Zhemkova from the Memorial. Well, what about Memorial? I don't suppose if we speak about the civics and the society, then the Memorial is, how shall I put it? It's the cornerstone. It's like, as they put it in English, is a fundamental basis, is a foundation of what Stefan Melle, managing director of DRA since 2002, a journalist and expert on East Europe, and Vytis Jurkonis from Vilnius, also a constant participant of all projects in the school, is director for projects in Freedom House, at Freedom House, and comes from Vilnius. But I just gave a quick introduction to our guests. Barbara, shall I give first the floor to you, so that you could, well, the future is here on us, and what is it going to be like? Well, of course.
Not well,
yes.
Yeah, I will speak in English, please. It's faster and will be better for you in the end, I promise. The future is now. What a great motto. Thank you to Lena, Inna, and everybody who thought about it. And thank you for your wonderful introductions, because it was the bird's view, and we are now in the middle of the real thing, and the lucky ones to look at the future. I think the future is always with us, but it is especially important to look at it in Russia, because in our discussions about Russia, it is part of very efficient disinformation that we keep looking at what Russia does abroad, as we do this week and these days, again in the Ukrainian context, but we look too little at what is going on in Russia inside in society. And therefore I, although I'm an outsider, also want to put my focus on this as the future now. Because also, if we do look inside, the discussion at the moment centers all the time about rising authoritarianism, repression, closing space, disinformation. But we at the Prague Civil Society Center, we live with a parallel Russia, which is often overseen. It is very present here, but I think it needs to be seen in a wider context also. I think Denis Volkov gave us some insight yesterday when he spoke about, the apathy diminishing in Russia and the horizontal ties growing. That's exactly the Russia that I think we should all be focusing on more. And there are many representatives here also from the neighbors of Russia, which I find is wonderful about Lena's school. And please do take notice of this other Russia. We are working with it also because a lot of it is still very local and informal. It is beyond, the traditional classical registered NGO landscape that we see here with Lena's school, that we see here with Memorial. It's many informal, small groups, and they are important because while we discuss the closing of space all the time, especially because they are small and local, they are opening new spaces. It's the opposite of closing space, it's opening space. And something is growing there which one day, may all grow together into some opening of a bigger scale. What is most important about this, I think, is that while this social, they always call it the social contract, that the political system built with society, it is dysfunctional today, and therefore in this vacuum, these groups and these dynamics are building a new connection with Russian society in a larger sense. And I think if we look at the 1990s, from my point of view, one of the biggest mistakes that we all did, both the Western supporters but also Russian civil society, was the lack of connectedness to society itself. We, in a way, ignored this too much, and it is a big opportunity to make up for it now. Well, in some ways, civil society is really future now, always, in its essence. But I think it is particularly important in Russia because the political regime itself is totally bent on the past. So it is an even bigger task than normal for civil society to look at the real issues, at the ills that haven't been solved, as Denis Volkov said yesterday, at the real issues affecting people. And nobody else the state is not doing it. It's not looking at a future solving the issues that really affect citizens' lives. Toxic landfills, urban development, property rights, healthcare. And also, I think civic groups are increasingly successful at addressing the deeper, more sensitive issues, prison conditions, torture. That is somebody has to do it. It is civil society. And I always like what Irina Prokhorova said a few years ago. She said, "My ni marginali." We are not marginal. We are the avant-garde, actually addressing tomorrow's problems today. And I think this is how it has to be seen. In one of the many workshops and hackathons and bar camps we had a group in Armenia the other day who came out of their working session and say, "We now know who we are. We are seeds. We are little seeds. What we do today is going to open up in some way tomorrow. And I think this is future now. So if I may just point to 4 seeds that I see growing in Russia, which I think are very, very important to see already now. The first is that society in a larger way is beginning to look at a need for change. We haven't had this for too long, but the opinion polls are perhaps as questionable they are in authoritarian times. They still are an interesting glance into a future that perhaps already exists, you know, for the wishes of people and the projections they make. And I found it very startling, this study by Mikhail and others, that 91% of Russians today no longer rely on the state to solve any of their problems. And I think that means that this social contract is not just dysfunctional, it is basically dead. So we have an empty field that needs new seeding, and it is I hope that Russian civil society and other groups in society understand that there has to be a new implantation of a total void that has developed over the last 20 years. And it's very interesting, in the same study, 80% say the last thing they want is a stronger government. They want justice and they want problems to be solved, but not a stronger government. So if you don't want a stronger government, then you want a stronger dynamics in society. So this is future now, and I hope that civil society will be having the energy. I feel it here, but I want it in a bigger way to use this this vacuum for a good future tomorrow. Then the second thing is that what I feel very much, what we all feel in our work, is that in general, civil groups are becoming smarter, more efficient, and more active in this deficit of the 90s, in reconnecting to society, in catching up where we lost a lot in the last 20 years. We train them, but there is already a lot of knowledge and a lot of competence out there in using new formats, in using new technological tools, in using a new language, storytelling, new narratives, long reads, short videos, infographics. It's all happening in a space which, you know, we don't feel and see every day, but the landscape of communication between civil society and society at large is changing. And it is being more efficient than I have seen it in a long time. If I just take the project of Team 29, the human rights lawyers group that you have in St. Petersburg, you know, they have built up a website where they now reach with videos on torture. They reach 30 to 50,000 people in a month. And they say themselves, before we were advocates and we had about 30 clients coming in and out of our office. But today, with a skillful and clever and deeper use of modern communications, they are reaching an audience that before wouldn't even have talked or watched anything about torture. Takiye Dila is the other wonderful project. It is talking about, but also very complicated and sensitive social issues, you know, like HIV and other marginal groups. It's reaching an audience sometimes of 2 million people in Russia. And what I find very interesting is that they combine it with fundraising. This is going to the becoming citizens, you know, when people read and then at the same moment push on a button and decide, this is so appalling, but I want to at least give my share to make something better. And I mean, we heard Elena Pamphilova yesterday, but this fundraising efforts of her transparency side, and especially of the New Times, with even 25 million rubles being raised in a few days to continue to work, you know, to actually, this is not just friends of friends of friends, this is larger society wanting that active groups continue their work. I mean, this is, to me, the beginning of community, общество граждан, that we are discussing here, because this is society linking itself to the work of active groups. And that's a first way of being active yourself. This third element that I see is seeds is the classical one. It's the young generation. I think Russia has its own generation Z, as it's called, you know, the ones that are under 25 now. And we work with them all the time, also in the other neighboring countries. And it is a small part, I know, of this generation Putin that we have. But it's also not just generation Navalny. There is something between radical protest and mainstream adaptation. It's a new generation that is ready to risk things, to be actively involved in society. We are very impressed with the energy and the courage. There is a first generation, I think, without strach and ready to go into active involvement for issues that they feel are important. And these are seeds of a future now that, you know, we have to already see today, because these are people who are ready also to be fined and to be arrested and even to really pay a personal price for what they do. And again, if I speak about Team 29 and their website, you look at it. There is a handbook there, how to go to a meeting and come out unscathed. Then there is the most interesting project of theirs is an interactive game where you go through all the different moments of being detained. And you are taught in a very interesting, you know, modern way to survive and behave cleverly regarding your rights when you have somebody knocking at your door to collect you. 80% or 75% of the users of this website are under 35 years of age. And I think each one of them is a seed of future now to me. And the last thing is Armenia, because I think it is really having a deeper lesson also for Russia and certainly for the whole, whole post-Soviet space that Russia is connected to and the epicenter of. It was a classical case of what you said this morning, you know, it was meant to last forever until it stopped. That's what all the Armenians tell you. They did not expect it themselves to happen. It's like the fall of the wall, like the raspad of the Soviet Union. It comes when you don't expect it. And it was, what is the deeper lesson? It was not just the leadership of Nikol Pashinyan. It was, as all our Armenian friends tell us, it was a very special synergy between younger activists and society at large, and social media and communication in general being used to communicate between those two. That is what got skeptical, disaffected citizens to go out and make this Velvet Revolution possible. So I think the lesson there is it was 10 years since 2008, since the first, violent clashes and setbacks, 10 years of setbacks and failures in Armenia, which were used exactly like Adam Michnik said, going and using the time of hibernation of winter to learn, to gain experience, to make reflection on how you act better the next time. And I think this is something to be shared with all the societies in the neighborhood. And this is why we keep working also as Western partners, as close friends with these groups, because we are convinced that we must use the time now of closing space in order to for these seeds to grow well and be better prepared, as everyone says here, than we were in the 1990s. Okay.
Just a
Буквально одну минуту вашу займу.
minute. Last week in Russia, in Krasnodar, they arrested a rapper. Husky, yes. Husky is his name, and what was immediately clear that we're speaking here about censorship, about some illegal, so to say, persecution, what did Generation Z did? It went out to a concert which took place yesterday. He was set free yesterday immediately. This much comes in contrast of illustration of what it was like. We look at what goes on in our theatre community, how our creative intelligentsia, how it responded to the arrest of Kirill Serebrennikov and those who came from Studio 7. This is Generation Z that immediately goes out and says no to this. Generation Z. In October, we saw the names returned again, and apart from the people of senior age and my age, they were high schoolers, just teenagers were there. They also thought about the memory. Elena, may I ask you, yes, if you will, tell us please how this Generation Z, if it's there, and if you meet them, if you communicate them, what is their thinking about? What are they thinking about today? And why is memory important to them? And why is it an institution? Well, they will now put on a short presentation, and as I spoke on behalf of the memorial, I'd like to remind you that what the memorial stands for. This is, and it is very important, it's a horizontal network. Horizontal, mind you, this is what is important. Horizontal network of people who are together because of the idea they share. The idea, when they say of the need to know the truth about the past. And this is needed not because of, epidemic institution, because we need it, we, my colleagues and I, because we want our life today to be normal, and even more so, we want tomorrow to be normal. And this idea that we could bring together the truth about the past in, normal life today, it means that we bring together history and human rights. This is something that is inspiring people in the memorial. This horizontal network of equals, of peers. That is why I'm just stressing the word horizontal. They want me to give some inspiring example. I'd like to say that overall, I'm inspired by the work that the memorial do, as my granny used to say. If they ask you after your death what you did in life, I'd say, I did this and that. And this is something that has been really this is something I enjoy. I could give you many examples, but I chose this.
Well, I wanted to draw your attention to this project of memorial, which is 19 years old. There have been over 30,000 school children who have participated in it. And it's a major archive which we have accumulated over the past 20 years with what has been happening with the historical memory, or indeed the restoration of the historical memory. Interestingly, that we have a lot more competition. Has been a big project taking and unfolding for many years, and indeed it was a technologically well balanced project. How the competition is being called, it's a formalized procedure. And even though this competition is being conducted by the memorial, we have no didactic assignments. We are not suggesting that school children write about the time of the repressions. No, all we are asking is to write about a human being in the 20th century Russia. And clearly, by acquiring help from the teachers or the professors, we ask them to be honest about their particular contribution, because we are not interested in just internet resources to be quoted. No, we're interested in the honest personal representation, and we get about 2,000 essays every year, and about 40 finalists are invited to Moscow. Usually that takes place at the end of April. We invite them to Moscow to a concluding seminar and an award ceremony. Because we do believe that it is important to keep in touch with these 40 finalists out of almost 1,500 or 2,000. We wish to talk to these young people, and it's a 5-day, quite a busy program in Moscow that they have. So they write their essay, then they present, they go for tours, and then we have this very festive ceremony with about from 500 to 600 persons attending, including some notable public and cultural figures in Russia. And thanks to the foundation of Mikhail Prokhorov, we have been able to have these finalists to have an additional competition to allocate 5 stipends, student stipends, to 5 of these 40 finalists who get enrolled or admitted to the Russian universities. Now, what is important as a result of this project is that we can see that a more sustainable core of teachers, school teachers, that has been formed. Probably not too many for Russia's expanse, but still it's a group of 600 teachers, not too bad in my view. And these are people who have been very active in these projects. And one may say that there's nothing particularly new in this project. Well, this is true, but it is the inexhaustible well of history of Russia that we are seeing, and the amazing stories that we receive, and some of the results are really startling. And I would like to quote one of these examples. This summer, our school children had school practice in the archive of the Memorial Foundation. So they were working with our documents, with our papers. They were helping us to scan and digitize, because in the next 2 years we would like to digitize the entire archive of the memorial. It's over 2 million pages. It's a big archive. And a part of this archive is related to a very little remembered persons. These are the former Ostarbeiter, those who were taken by the Nazis to work in Germany in the war years. Now, these people became the victims of 2 dictatorships. They were taken to Germany as slave labor, and then they fell victim to Djugashvili's dictatorship, to the Soviet regime, because on returning to the Soviet Union, they of course were indicted and condemned to Gulag as the war criminal. Thank you. I just wanted to show you these fragments, just to show that by the experience of the memorial, which has many different projects, almost each one of our projects is very inspiring, because we do get a lot of gratitude. It's very gratifying work. Memorial Foundation is engaged with gratifying projects, because to responding to Sasha's question, to me the answer is clear. And this, going on with this routine everyday work, what we have to do is to create and recreate the infrastructure of the memory. And this is what we call, and this is what needs to be done now and here, because because when the witnesses are gone and they are leaving us, when the generations are gone, then the trail grows cold. And secondly, we have to work to try and make this issue of legal qualification of the crimes at a situation when most of the criminals are dead. Thank you. Stefan, if I may address you with the question of what is to be done. Thank you. Stefan Melle is with us. It's not easy to mount this rostrum after watching this cartoon. Our work is intrinsically related to our past. And my history, it's also my history because I come from Germany, and we are responsible for this even if we were not the perpetrators. So we are very grateful to the memorial for doing this work. There are many German organizations, the German-Russian Exchange, and my organization, which deal with these principally important subjects. And to us, the European civil society, these projects of memory are never fading in importance because we can't just speak about isolated countries. We literally have to take into account the complex multifactorial aspects of this problem. This seminar is entitled In Search of Lost Universalism. And yesterday, the president of the German Bundestag, Professor Dr. Lammert, said that we are lacking this universalism. And it is true. When he quoted Francis Fukuyama's book title, it was quite reasonable to think about the horizons. And in 1989, in this brilliant year of 1989 of the European unification and rejuvenation, we saw the Tiananmen massacre in China, and the Chinese new spiral of the Chinese totalitarianism indeed started in 1989. So we can't isolate things in world history and in world affairs. So we have to combine these sometimes very different lines. If we remember 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of the two Germanys, and in the Soviet Union, which was still alive and kicking, as they say, but there were already military clashes in Lithuania. So we can't say that 1989 was a cloudless year. By far, no. This was indeed still a year with a lot of violence and encroachments upon freedom. Today, when we speak about the future, we have to indeed change our horizons. We frontline strategies which must be in our minds relate not only to human societies, but they also relate to the ecology. Yesterday, I think we had an excellent environmental presentation on climate, and indeed, I think that this is something that needs to be told and thought about every day by every person on earth. At least understand that our future is not just about it's not about us as species, but also about the ecosystem around us. So we have to try and understand what is stability and what is sustainability. How and to what extent can we build our social relations? And what is modernization? It is, of course, about technologies, it is about lifestyles, but also sometimes social developments may be very different. Sometimes we feel that that there is a gap, a huge gap between politics and our perception of the rights. And I think that one of our major tasks is to cover this gap between our perception of values and politics. And even though this gap is never filled, it is still an eternal task. In some countries and in some societies, and I'm very glad that Germany is in the vanguard, we have a co-governance concept, co-governance by civil society, which is a form whereby some issues are resolved not just by the executive branch, the government or the parliament, but there is a referendum-like survey, which is what the citizens can voice. And how can this affect the politics of parties, the politics of the government? And as you understand, this opens new big vistas for all of us. But this is not, this is a very debatable issue, of course, because legitimization is also important. We have to understand what is the basis for the civic activists to participate in the matter of government. This may work when the governments when it's not just about Gongo, but independent actors. We are often perceiving the life and projects in the civic society on a simple bullet list or bullet point basis, whereby we just check the little boxes against each field. I think this is a myth. I think that civic initiatives can hardly be measured as a tick box process. I think that the civic society is involved in thousands of very different venues, in hundreds formats, sometimes they're related, sometimes redundant, sometimes they're small groups. So diversity is, in my view, the most important fabric of civil society. And so we should really watch this as complex as the life is itself. A couple of weeks ago, there was a big rally in Germany, probably one of the largest, hundreds of thousands of people went to streets. And this was a demonstration which was entitled The Undividable. What it meant was the undivided civil society. What was the right-wing populism, our losses in the public space, where I think our democratic institutes are at risk, even our discourse, even our willingness to accept people from other countries if they're in peril. So the part of the civil society united to say that they are undividable and that they have to and this is a polarization. This is a challenge which is something that we're all concerned about. So what happens in these civic movements is that there is an anti-democratic part of the civic society may even be anti-democratic, and we can't help understanding this. Yuri Senokosov said this morning that freedom is not about choice. Freedom is in the basis of every choice. Are there boundaries in a democratic society? What happens if the majority votes for an undemocratic government, undemocratic mechanism? What happens if the majority of society votes for the undemocratic government? This is something that we all lived through. Sometimes we have a perception that society is more efficient when people are heard, when their voices are heard. I agree with this. And at the same time, we have to understand if people have to say something, if they really have the perception of where will their choices take them. So I think that, and I think Alexander Arkhangelsky spoke about it, that we are often remembering the 1990s, the time of transformation, the transition, which was a very, very difficult time. So it seems to us at times that we have to strengthen and intensify the dialogue about this transformation period of the 1990s. What did it lead to in the lives of people? Next year we shall celebrate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we shall also remember the decades, 3 decades of the fall of the Soviet Union, which is a strange jubilee. It gave many people freedom and liberty, and it also led to tragedies for many other people. And we all survive these things. And transition dialogue is what we need. It is of principal importance. What we have to start is in our organization, as I've already mentioned, we try in the European context and with our European colleagues.
We started to build the European coalition about the conflict in the Donbass. Today we found ourselves in the situation when things are boiling. And it's clear that Crimea and Donbass are also indivisible. In point of fact, they belong to the same region. It's one and the same problem. There's ambitions and of the Russian leadership, even to keep all the post-Soviet countries close under their practical leadership, and this is done through the use of military force. But at the same as this goes on, and it seems again, we are seeing yet another escalation. We need to work to those things about what would happen next. There was an example that Adam Mishnik drafted a law when the communist government will be gone. Right now is exactly the time to go and look into the options of how in Eastern Europe people would live together after the post-imperial ambitions of the Russian leadership will cease to exist. They should. This coalition that I'm referring to, it just says that, how do you remember about this? What was there in the 2014 and how different our ideas about the past and the future of Donbass? How do you move in a region that indeed is at war? As right now, can we prepare the models of justice, and not just before the court, but justice as equity? And where is the fairness? Where is the equity? We'll have to look about this well into the future. This is when we have to develop and look for and find right now future compromises. The last point I wish to make is we are good civic activists when we work with people, for the sake of people, but when sometimes we may be inconvenient. Independent means we must speak about things that nobody is keen to discuss. It was just obvious how important it is about the past. And there is a lot hidden there. Seems like bandit is something that is not well desirable. But one has to speak about this, saying that I'm weak now, EU now. It's very inconvenient now because it's in part getting to recognize that, acknowledge that. It's also inconvenient to say that it's also questioning many of the arguments we have. It is questioning in principle, many things that we do. That very fact that we are indeed in risk, that the cultures may end in some kind of clash of civilizations, and that happened in the 1990s too. Not Fukuyamas, who thought that it's all over and things will be fine, or rather that things may get so much worse and horrible, and we haven't really moved away from that. So this, in the coming years, in decades, I suppose, this is a very important objective. We should defend our basics. This is a common European project that is questioned because some people do not want to be. They would much rather stay away from this community. But on average, this is really the prerequisite of peace, of mutual understanding, opportunity to work together, of solidarity. We have not yet identified what it would look like. Each person identifies it for oneself. And we should work with information not to get this pseudo or quasi-information. And this is where we are all for enlightenment. This is something that we still have to do. And it seems like it's no important whether they're small countries or big countries. If you look at who feels fine, this would be happier. They are who? Russians? Or Estonians? Or is it Armenia? I visited Yerevan several days ago, and I can tell you this is an amazing people who right now felt how strong they are, because they will determine their future. So they are all around only military conflicts with Azerbaijan, with Turkey, and you name it. strong hand in Russia. That was the vision before. The question is how to build Eurasian integration or European integration. It's not yet been addressed and it's becoming difficult, and they still feel that they can do it. And this is what I desire for us all for the future. Thank you. Stefan switched our conversation into a more global context and format, where the Russian civic society, we are certainly universal. This is what we have been saying for second day in a row. That is why we'd like to give the floor to Mr. Ambassador and ask him what can the civil society do to oppose those populist cause. It is not in Russia alone winning this, but as we can see, and we've been discussing it for second day in a row, it's in many other countries too.
Well, far be it from me to break the tradition of standing at the podium. Thank you very much, Mikhail, and thank you, Elena, Yuri, and all of the others involved in this fabulous association for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'll try and make it brief, but I'm not very good normally at doing that because I'm Irish, and I have what we call the gift of the gab, the ability to endlessly talk around the same kind of subject. But let me just begin by trying to connect with some of the comments that were made by the previous speakers. First of all, I'm absolutely blown away by what Barbara said about 91% of Russians no longer relying on the state to provide almost any of their needs. This is just extraordinary. I am completely blown away by it. I would never have anticipated that sort of a statistic on that kind of a scale. But I think it speaks a lot to what is happening to a global society. And I cannot wait to see Russia explode on the scene peacefully in a manner that brings to the rest of the world the benefits of this extraordinary efflorescence of civil society that is obviously taking place with Generation Z, as you called it. And I think the prospect of crowdfunding of civil society is the answer to, as it were, the demonization of NGOs in some parts of the world as foreign agents, that this is the way to overcome that particular problem. The next thing I would like to comment on is Elena Zhemkova's extraordinary presentation on Memorial, and say that it is very like a project which I launched when I was in Ukraine. By the way, I was introduced to you as a member of an Irish institute simply because one needs an institutional hat. But actually, I served 32 years in the United Nations, and my last position was as the UN representative and coordinator in Ukraine from 2004 to 2009. Now, and so now I'm just an old age pensioner. I'm not really working for anybody. When I was in Ukraine with Katerina Yushchenko, the former First Lady, and with the Intel Corporation, we put together a project which was somewhat similar, almost remarkably similar to what Elena has described. And it was basically going to schools. It actually came out of an experience I had personally when I went and stopped at an old folks' home on the outskirts of Kiev, on the fringe of a forest. And this was a home which was built for great artists of the Soviet Union, world-famous composers, scientists, and other people who had all kinds of medals. And each one of them had a tiny little bedroom and a wardrobe, and on top of that, a few old boxes. And there's nothing that they liked more than to take all of that down and show you the press coverage from the Soviet days and Pravda, Izvestia, or whatever, about all the wonderful things they had done and all the wonderful places they had gone. And these people were left alone. Nobody was visiting them anymore. Not family, nobody. An Italian NGO was coming occasionally with medicines. And I thought, these people have such an extraordinary experience, but so does everybody of that generation in the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Russia, and elsewhere. They've lived through the types of experiences, the extraordinary experiences that have to be remembered, because we learn and we must often not repeat, or we at least must cherish, as it were, the virtues that they managed to endure with and that saved them from a fate worse than death. But what we did with that project was we got the schools in the country, the young people, to go and meet the old people, to interview the old people, to build up biographical profiles, and this was to go on the internet as a sort of a historical memory project. And it's very like something which in my own country, in Ireland, we had in the 1930s. It became the National Schools Folklore Collection. And in the 1930s, young people were asked to go and talk to their elders and record experiences. And they were also given specific topics to look at. And one of them was the Great Famine in Ireland, when in the 1840s, the Irish population dropped dramatically because we had a population of about 8 to 10 million at a time when the UK population was the English population was about 15 million. So we were practically 80% of what the English population was, whereas today we're only about 10%. And we lost 2 million people from the famine, and a pattern of emigration that only really began to reverse in the 1990s, almost 150 years later. Now that Irish famine was to Ireland what the Golodomor was to Ukraine and to some of the other former Soviet countries that were affected by Stalinism. And so I just wanted to mention this. But we did something with the National Schools Folklore Collection, which you might want to take note of. It's that UNESCO has, in 2003, brought about a convention on the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. And I lobbied the Irish government, which was a bit lackadaisical about this, to go and ratify this convention. And eventually, well, the government and the parliament ratified the convention, and they took up on two of my proposals. One was that the Irish tradition of playing bagpipes should be regarded as a cultural heritage. And the other one was the sport of hurling. That's a kind of like hockey, but you play it with a stick and an almost rock-solid ball. So both of these have now been registered with UNESCO as elements of World Heritage, and so has the National Schools Folklore Collection. So this is something you might like to think of, getting it registered with UNESCO as an element of intangible cultural heritage from Russia. And we could do the same for Ukraine with the similar project which we had there. Now, we've talked a little bit about universalism yesterday, and I just wanted to say that I think there are three fundamental erosions of authority which are affecting our perception of universalism. There's an erosion of political authority, which we see practically universally, of religious authority, which we see in the decline of practice, in particular in my own country, which is now being called a post-Catholic country. And there's an erosion of scientific authority, which we see clearly in the antics of President Trump in rejecting the climate deal, the Paris Agreement, and everything else. And these erosions of authority are partly a result of an information revolution, but I think they are also partly a result of a sort of a populistic reflex. And we have a problem in terms of reflexes, I would say. It's that, I call it the baby bathwater reflex. We see a problem, and the Irish are particularly bad at this, actually. We see a problem and we want to throw out the bathwater, but sometimes we want to throw out the baby. And I think the problem that we have would say, just take an institution such as the United Nations. The United Nations rightly comes in for a huge amount of criticism because of the failures of the Security Council to address global security. But how can it, when it has got 5 permanent veto-wielding powers, who are the winners of World War II, and that's the only thing that they can say about themselves, but they're also the largest manufacturers of arms around the world, and we entrust our security to these arms manufacturers. It makes no sense to me. And it needs to be reformed. And I think the reform, you can talk about enlarging the Security Council. And by the way, Ireland is a candidate for the Security Council in the coming years. We are competing, I think, with the Canadians and perhaps the Belgians or somebody else like that. And the difference between Ireland and the other competitors for the Security Council seat is that Ireland is standing strongly behind the treaties to ban nuclear weapons, okay, whereas the others are not. Okay, so remember that. The problem is that I think we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We reject something, we reject an institution because of a flaw, instead of fixing it. We need to fix these things. One of the hidden secrets of the UN, most people don't recognize it, is and I mean by the UN, I mean the whole UN system, which includes some institutions that predate the UN, like the Universal Postal Union or the International Labour Organization, which are actually 19th century institutions. But we have seen over the past decades, especially since the end of the Second World War, an extraordinary explosion in international law. There's an enormous exponential growth in international law. So whatever you think about values and norms, you are challenged perhaps by the contradictions of countries disobeying treaty obligations, violating these norms, governments doing the same thing. But they are there. Don't throw them away. They don't necessarily need to be changed, the ones that are there. Well, maybe some old Universal Postal Union regulation about the post being delivered in horse-drawn carriages, maybe that needs to be changed. But most of the rest of it, I think, is pretty solid. What we need are institutions of enforcement. The institutions need to be reformed and changed and improved. And so that is something that I think that needs to be done. And there are some areas where we need additional global regulation. We need it in the area of cyberspace, for sure, and artificial intelligence, and connected to that, drones and their use in warfare. We shouldn't have autonomous machines deciding who lives and who dies. We need it in the area of biotechnology. And I will say in one other area, which relates to a question I posed yesterday. I believe that we need it in the area of global corporations. And I say this because there are diminishing returns from globalization, in addition to the many, many, many benefits that are too well known by too many of us. But the power of corporate influence, which we have seen with the digital media, has manifested itself very crudely in electoral manipulation recently. And I think the fundamental problem comes back to something that Frederick Erickson was talking about yesterday, market concentration. We see in so many markets that they are becoming more and more concentrated. And I made reference yesterday to Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, which produced a report on this in April 2016. And it indicated, the title of the report was something like The Benefits of Competition. But in actual fact, it was about market concentration. Market concentration is that situation where one player or just a few players dominate the whole market, and they work to exclude the others. So they assessed that in the US economy, in most sectors, the standard metrics showed large and often enormous increases in market concentration. This was not true only of the internet giants and social media, but increasingly is the case in the mainstream media, telecommunications, energy, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, retail, trade and transport, banking and finance, insurance, agro-industry, think Monsanto, real estate, utilities, tourism and consultancy services, think KPMG, just down the road. In particular, dominant firms engage in predatory behavior. They increasing rents and reducing new firm entry and labour market mobility. And that gets to the challenge of entrepreneurship that was touched upon yesterday. There's a decline in entrepreneurship because the opportunities quite often are not there. People are being squeezed out of markets. The global conglomerates also are increasingly moving to exploit non-national resources, the global commons, planetary ecosystems, and public goods that lie outside individual national sovereignty, for example, in the ocean and in the Earth's orbit and outer space. And think of what we have already as a problem in the oceans with floating plastic, etc. But we have a UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We have an international seabed authority, although exploration companies abroad have substantial contracts. America is not part of it. But when you have the largest source of capital in the world not buying into a convention like this, just as not buying into the climate convention, we have major problems. And these things, I think, are things that need to be addressed. Now, in 1970, there was a famous legal case, the Barcelona traction case. And since then, there have been efforts to try and regulate the behavior of what were initially called transnational corporations. Later on, they became called multinational corporations. And now we talk about global giants, global corporations. We do not have a legal framework internationally binding on these organizations, these corporations, these firms. And the problem is not just a question of private sector capital, because we have, with the advent of China and its adoption of capitalism, and Russia, We have various forms of state capitalism, which are enormously influential. And the problem is follow the money. Follow the money. Why do you follow the money? Because then you have to see where the accountability lies. So I say follow the money, whether it's civil society, whether it's repression, whether it's arms manufacturing. Follow the money. See where it's coming from and pin down the accountability. That's the issue. We need to demand and enforce accountability. Otherwise, we have irregular situations. So what we have in the UN, a global compact, which Kofi Annan brought about during his Secretary Generalship. And this was a set of principles, nice stuff, gender equality, environmental stuff, stewardship, do no harm, human rights, and a bunch of things like that, integrity, transparency, and accountability. And companies, about 60 to 70,000 around the world, have signed on to these principles. And they will produce annual reports about how wonderful they are and how everything is going very rosy. The OECD also has its corporate governance principles, which were revised and adopted by the G20 in 2015. But these, like the Global Compact, are non-binding. And in fact, within corporations, these issues are dealt with more on the corporate social responsibility or media and marketing side of a company, rather than on the legal side. So my point of view on this is that we need to have a global international convention on the role of global corporations. And it's not that we're not asked, I would say, not to ask the corporations to regulate themselves, but the nation state still has a role. Even if it has less and less of a role in satisfying people's demands, it still has a role in the international sphere and domestically in terms of economic governance. We need a global convention on the international legal standing of multinational global corporations, their rights and responsibilities, with an obligatory code of conduct and enforcement mechanism. But we also need to reform global and national regulation of competition. Now, there's a European competition network, and I think the EU commissioner who has been taking on the corporate giants like Apple has been doing a very good job at it. Member states have been doing less of a good job, and sometimes the competition network is really just about consumer standards or something like this. Unless we have better regulation of competition, and I mean regulation in the sense of ensuring the marketplace is open to diversity of actors, new entrants to come in so that entrepreneurship can flourish. If that doesn't happen, I think we're basically handing all our money to global giants who eventually will dictate the order of the day. And in the media area, this is a particular threat to democracy. And I think we've seen with the Trump campaign, but also the Mueller investigation and the Brexit story, how challenging this is. And I will add one more thing and then I'll stop because I think I'm probably running over, no? I might, okay, well you're gonna kick me when I do. And it's this basic issue, it's that, and some people have brought it up already, there are some people in the world who are phenomenally wealthy. The latest Oxfam figures that I saw was that something like 8 people, now not 53 or 63 or 78 or whatever, but 8 people have the wealth of half of humanity. And there is something, I mean, I'm not against private wealth, there is something obscene with that level of power and influence, especially when at much junior levels of such wealth, you can already see the pervasive influence in corruption. The story about Mr. Banks, Aaron Banks, and how he's affected the Brexit vote. The jury's out on that. But I mean, the idea that an individual can have so much money that they can directly influence, as Berlusconi has done in Italy, for example, popular perceptions to such a degree because they have a monopolistic position in the marketplace, in the media, or they have such phenomenal wealth that they can throw it at an issue. I'm not comfortable with that. And although people like George Soros can do it in a good way, I mean, we in the UN accepted some Soros money at a certain time for civic programs, and I think that's a good thing. When you hand it to the right institution, which is subject to the proper norms, that's okay. But if you're setting up an organization that's going to be directly interfering in the politics of another country, I don't think that that's healthy for democracy in the long run. So I think there's a number of issues that we need to be focusing on for the future. One, I think we should extol a vision of the world based on human dignity and universal values, and upholding the highest standards of leadership, integrity, and competence. And I think this comes back to the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's no need to throw it out. There's not even much need to change it. There is a need to respect it and to enforce it and to have the institutional strength and vibrancy to demand accountability from those who fail to do so. The second thing I think is there is a need to address growing inequality. But here's the good news. We've never had it so good. We have never, ever in human history had it so good. Most of us are far better off than any of our ancestors were. And we fail sometimes to recognize this. In fact, in the past few decades alone, the UN Global Human Development Report indicates that there's been a 20% increase in the level of human development around the world, and in particularly in the least developed countries. But the problem is that the stratum of society that has benefited the least from recent progress is the working and lower middle classes, especially in Germany and the United States and a few other countries like that, in Britain in particular. So, and that's where grievance arises. And if we don't recognize grievance, there's a lot of myth in populism, but there's a lot of grievance which is legitimate and well-founded. There are parts of Britain, there are parts of England today, which I think it was King Edward VI almost caused a constitutional crisis going there, complaining about the government neglect of these parts of England and Wales. They are the very same places where the votes were highest for Brexit. So you could say there has been an intergovernmental, between changes of government, of different political parties, neglect of these areas and their needs for inclusive growth, basically. So we need to address the equality issue, and we need to, as I said, deal with the questions of market concentration, regulation of the markets, and the role of the global corporations. There's a lot more we need to do, but I'm going to stop there because otherwise I never will. Thank you.
Thank you. Вам выходит, можно чуть-чуть больше, да, но чтобы у нас осталось еще время поговорить, потому что это всегда очень полезно. Да, прошу.
Mikhail, I think every panel needs its own Rostovsky, right? It's just yesterday we had really a good discussion. I'm not pretending to be Mr. Rostovsky at the level of his, but I'll try to be a devil's advocate and a bit challenge some of the thoughts which were said here. Because I felt there is too much optimism here. I also felt that while talking about the future, we were talking too much about the past. The past is important. We need to talk about it, because without acknowledging the past, we cannot actually think of the future. But I think there was too much of that. On the other hand, I also heard, especially in the speech of Ambassador O'Donnell, somewhat, speaking about the rich or the institutions, that there's something which is beyond our control, that something needs to be done. And I'll try to speak a little bit more about the individual level, about what we, perhaps as the individuals, as the community, can do. And when we talk about the future, it's complicated. The future is the Q&A session, the follow-up question session after the discussion. Tomorrow is the future. Next week is the future. And this is something that is in our horizon of what we can control and what we can plan. But I think that when the title of this topic is a little bit more than what we can actually, beyond of what we can plan. And I think with this, then it comes, there are a lot of issues of unpredictability. I've heard something here about the robots, about the unpredictable future, about the climate change, about the apocalypse that might come. I've heard a little bit about the promise, about expectations, about the dream or an illusion, perhaps also fear. It could be anything depending on our emotions, but I would emphasize just a couple of words when we talk about the future. It's the risk, and most of all, responsibility. The title of the panel, Future is Now, sounds like a commercial or an ad, and maybe that's a good thing. I think that we need catchy slogans when we talk about concepts like universalism, values, citizenships. I think that they desperately need something catchy. My Belarusian colleague, a very talented art director, once had an argument with the Belarusian human rights defenders, where we wanted to convince Belarusian human rights defenders, really prominent, spectacular ones, that the old vocabulary is simply not appealing anymore. We need catchy, we need sexy, we need fun, rather than, universal declaration of human rights. Because we want people to actually believe in that, not the elites, not only few, but people. And some human rights defenders were disgusted. They were saying to us, you want to make human rights like McDonald's of some sort? And this art director said, yes, in fact, exactly that. Human beings are strange. They don't want to be accused of being snobbish. Once you call for simplification, they almost feel offended. I apologize in advance if I don't sound too sophisticated today. One reason for that is usually that I have a feeling that people are hiding behind the buzzwords. I can speak about innovation. I can speak about technology, blockchain. That would be something valid debating the future. But that would not be me. In fact, can one say anything about the future without being himself or herself? Is the future even possible without the present and the past? My beloved teacher of music at the music school was always encouraging me to feel the music or simply play it rather than focus on the technique. And since I mentioned music, those who ever played in the orchestra, I bet that some of you definitely did. Well, think of the future, what future means in the concerto. Like most of us are going to operas, concertos, and despite the fact that we heard it a number of times, one or the other, we still continue going, because it's not only about the script, it's also about the artist, about the interpretation. So the future here, like within concerto, is kind of predictable, right? We have notes and the script, and yet not entirely. It's about the motion, about the tempo, about the vision of the artist. It is an orchestra, in the orchestra, and I used to play the percussion, and the percussion is somewhat like difficult because you are waiting, like 24, and like minute number 5, I need to enter. It's like, and well, I'm too lazy to actually wait for it. So I will rely on my colleague who is playing the flute. And I know that. The flute enters and like just after that, there's my turn. But if the flute makes a mistake, then, and that's also an issue of the civil society. Stefan was talking about that there are many players in the field, so do we project a future without, as we are not playing as an orchestra? And there I actually think of a unity, not that it should be the top-down like unity, but in a way that we should play as an orchestra for the better future. So even with the script, every concerto is a surprise, a possible tremendous success or a failure. The same in life. However, there's much more at stake because it's our life. The concerto ends, we go home. And there comes the other word, which is risk. Belarusian colleagues know that I'm often accused of being an advocate for revolution rather than evolution. I can expect no more if I'm criticizing Alexander Lukashenko every day. The paradox is that, in fact, it's quite the opposite. Yes, I am for a change. Today, not tomorrow. I am for action, not for a promise. Regimes are promoting the illusion of stability, which is the opposite of change. Any change. It's a false promise. Dissatisfaction yesterday was mentioned. Anger breeds eventually, and the bubble blows up, explodes in the very hard way. Absence of change basically programs the eventual revolution. And when it comes, it certainly would not be the West guilty for that. It will be the authorities of the regime countries. The future is now. It's not enough to debate international principles, rule of law, freedom, human rights, and universalism in general. One needs to stand for one's principles and values every day. Being a person of reflection without being a person of action is a position of a bystander. It's mostly safe, but hardly leads to any change. The future is now, is some sort of a call for responsibility now. I'm calling for getting out of our comfort zone, getting out of our bubbles. It is hard, but it's one of the few prerequisites, if not the only one, for the change. One needs to push the boundaries every day, and that's a risk, that's an act, and that's a challenge. I know it's relatively easy for me coming from Lithuania. I'm coming from the country which is in the EU. Many people here live in the post-history that was mentioned, the Fukuyama world, right? It's somewhat a luxury to take everything for granted, to trust the system, and live happily ever after. That's what we were promised. However, you know it better than us, that nothing can be taken for granted. Ivan Krastev wrote a book, After Europe, right? I think that we have a couple of Hungarian and Polish colleagues here, and I think they are already experiencing some of it. So we have the responsibility to preserve, cherish, in Poland perhaps, to defend that future. World needs examples of success, because the change is not possible in Russia nor in Ukraine if there are no success stories still proving that Europe is actually functional and efficient. But since the audience is mostly Russian, a few reflections on what concerns me there. It is commonly accepted that the future is the young generation. And we've heard from Barbara, that there are plenty of really, really fascinating examples. I really admit that. But the picture in Russia is uneven. Russia is big. I met Artem Loskutov like he was in Lithuania just a month ago, you know. Вам здесь не Москва. You know, like basically saying, you know, like this is not Moscow, right? That what is happening in Moscow, St. Petersburg is not necessarily what is happening in Siberia. And you know, for me, the most terrifying thing when it comes to youth is what happened with the movements of артподготовка, Пензовское дело, Новое величие, detentions of teenagers, you know, torture. That is an assault on the future. And this is happening now. I mean, I take it, all these rappers and all of that, there are many good things. But we are talking somewhat about celebrities. But well, look at Serebrennikov, right? A celebrity and what? But when we talk about ordinary people, like sometimes people who are no names, I think this is also deserves some notion of the future. It is nice to be here and think that the future is bright when we talk about the universalism. But I fear that it's not. Unlike democracies, where we have checks and balances, where we can trust the script, the conductor, I think in the regime countries, trusting the script or the conductor is a dangerous thing. Yuri spoke about choice this morning, but most of the people are actually not a pro-choice. They want simply to be on the winning side, or at least they want to be not on the losing side. And thus inertia, comfort zone, and generally unwillingness to risk prevails. Thus, the future is what we make of it. If we are doing nothing for it, someone will make it instead of us. I'm happy the school is moving towards action, not the reflection. Projects, initiatives that will be discussed is something, in a way, a projection to the future. Little steps, small contributions for change. It is exactly the title of The Future is Now. We are planning the future now. However, I want to make a small note that too many projects are very formal. Too many of them are driven by the mandate which is imposed by donors, by implementers. And this is usually preserving the status quo, which is the opposite of change. Pushing the boundaries, getting out of our comfort zone is not. So the future is now. Be the change you want to be. And as a conclusion, I want to quote Lev Tolstoy by saying, do what you need to and come what may. Делай, что должен, и будь, что будет. Because if we do not act now, there is no future, at least not in a sense of our future. Thank you very much.
So we've been just taken out of our comfort zones, and let's stick to this plan. And please, let's move to sharp statements and questions. Yes, please.
Ура, я первая. Значит, меня зовут Юлия Галямина, я депутат Тимирязевского района. Я тут услышала много всего для себя вдохновляющих.
Many inspiring words.
Я хотела...
I've heard many inspiring words, and I've been at different events and conferences, and every place I'm hearing that one has to act, one has to stop being moody and brood, and one has to act. But I have a comment and a question at the same time. It seems to me that we have to talk about politics, because politics and the civil society are often being differentiated in Russia, and people say we're not dealing with politics. I'm only dealing with the civil society, like Mr. Oleshkovsky, who said. But without politics, nothing will change. Only politics may lead to change, because it's. Of course, the society must be changing, but together with the changes in the society, the laws are still being taken by politicians, and the laws. We have authored a law on local self-government for Moscow. And I'm very glad that it has been authored, because previously we've just been chatting away, and now we're going to participate in the elections to try and implement these laws. And at the same time, in Moscow and in Russia, many politicians and off-system and in-system necessarily are involved with civic projects. And this consensus between the civil society and the new politicians, the politicians of tomorrow, must be must exist. It must be established today. So, what is your opinion about these statements?
Kyiv, Ukraine. I was trying hard to understand who is the devil, because there is always, it's a part of the question, who are we? And I was lately becoming really tired of this solutionism, activism. Everyone has to take responsibility for everything, and the more people trying to get responsibility for everything, the worse it becomes. And we see those shallow manifestos that just enjoy life, take responsibilities, like McDonald's of activism now. You know, you just come, you have the basic menu of these shallow slogans, and then you are supposed to do something, and then the world becomes, as corporations teach us, the world becomes a better place no matter what you do, even if you sell cigarettes or Coca-Cola. It's like this. And my question maybe to panelists: do we have a right to have a contemplative life, like? In your opinion, do we tolerate the passivity, for example? If I am consciously making decision to not be part of this McDonald's of activism or ideas, just to contemplate this chaos of unconscious actions that we are trying to, as the people who are absolutely fed up with this TED Talks and all these new ways of propagating this action, meaningless in majority of cases, in my opinion. Do we have this right to be passive and have a
debate?
Thank you. Kristina Lagulian, Yerevan School of Political Studies. My question is for the first speaker. You mentioned the vacuum, and but if there is a vacuum, there is a real danger that could be filled this vacuum with the beautifully packaged dirt. So how to ensure crystallizing the best?
I come from Chisinau, from Moldova. I have a very specific question to Ambassador Mr. O'Donnell and to Vytis. In 2011, I attended the 10th anniversary of an intellectual think tank in Moscow, which presented the results of modeling a future concept on the early warning, based on the early warning system. And Mr. O'Donnell may know about this program, which is well known in the UN. And one of the conclusions in 2011 in this meeting was that in 2014, 2015, Moscow would go through one of the local regional conflicts with one of its neighbor countries, either the Ukraine or the Baltic states, and Russia would be isolated and sanctioned by the international community. This was in 2011. Another early warning signal was in 2025, Russia would face a major crisis. How do you generally, this is some part of mathematical complex and big data analysis, how do you treat such models? What is your opinion about such models? Thank you. Varuzhana Rutyunyan from the Moscow School, from Yerevan. I disagree with the statement that social contract no longer exists. On the example of Armenia, I can say that the revolution happened because of the fracture of the social contract which had existed. Which was exhausted and which simply could not lead to, it was not satisfying. There's an excellent book by Alexander Auzan, which is, I think, called The Economy of All, or The Economy of Everything. And I think that it has an excellent way he has a very interesting presentation as to how these social contracts can be built. And I may be wrong in understanding the social contract according to Locke, Hobbes, but the social contract does exist. Well, I'm Stanislav from Siberia. Let me thank Vytis and all panelists, but let me thank Vytis because one gets weary about the talk about the future and the young people. So there was talk that our generation would one generation later everything would be fine. So we're sitting in Berlin having this conference. Those who are 18 to 24 in Russia are only 6%. It's a very small fragment of the population, which is also about the future. We will all become Brezhnevs of Russia. We will be sitting in our offices simply because there will not be enough young people in Russia, an aging country. And when we speak about the young, it is a pity that Denis Volkov has left, but Andrei Kolesnikov is here. The young people in Russia are probably in many ways more conformist than some of the older generations. So in terms of the hopes for the future for these young people to build are not particularly bright. So conformism, unfortunately, we have missed a lot of time, and the infrastructure to recruit these young people is not there. And the infrastructure which is being created by the government today it exists in the regional universities, in the regional colleges of Russia. Many people would well understand how these youth policies are working. So I agree with Vytis that we should probably not be postponing too many things for the future. Thank you very much. Let me ask a question, just one question. What we're doing here for the second day, is it a gesture? Is it something that we do? Is this an act, or this is just talk? I have also been very attentive to the first session of today, and it was said that freedom is not choice. It was said that freedom is not choice, it's in the basis of choice. How do we engage in a discussion? We will speak about forms. We are telling each other through seminars and trainings how things can develop. But what would these trainings lead to if we don't perceive the world in a particular way? And there are some major questions as to what we have been active in. Let me unite my voice. Let me join in saying that programs, seminars, projects, instruments, and words are probably not particularly relevant, because we can certainly train voice, we can train playing a musical instrument, but we can't train to be civic-minded. We can't train to be civilized. It's not about, it's primarily about understanding. It is about a view, a worldview. Svetlana Shmelyov is here, who has been picketing in protest for 80 days through the story of Oleg Sentsov and others. And she is saying that you have now led to a situation of almost a military disaster. What is Anna doing, who is in Yaroslavl, and tells us how, as a teacher, how should a teacher talk to the class? What should a teacher do to be a partner to the school children? Even against the background of a highly militarized and militant propaganda.
Сказал Юра.
I don't know. I know only things that Jura has told us. We must know a lot. We must train in rhetorics, how better phrase things if God didn't give us this gift. But we should remember, it seems to me, that each and every one of us in where we are, and it doesn't depend upon training. It does not depend on what sort of number of people will be engaged in civil society. It depends upon you, but where you stand. This depends on you. What is your understanding of the world, and to which extent you personally can express it. There is nothing other than that, nothing else. To claim that politics is linked to civil society, well, it's good to say it in this audience, but practice sort of gives us a hint that in a country where, in our own country, any civil action is all about politics. How you make a distinction, who will give you this knowledge in your possible and probable behavior. But the problem is that those who want to do about civic reality that is in point of fact non-existent, they should first realize we are free because inside ourselves we don't have any choice. And secondly, which seems very important to me, not to never turn anything into these sensible moves. I'm so many years that I can speak about this, but what I want to say, I want to speak to you on behalf of my generation that is now going away. We have here Elena Zhemkova, and I think that Elena Zhemkova, not because she's here with us and the memorial is always with us and in our soul, Arseny Ragensky is gone. A whole world went away, disappeared, of understanding. Mirab Mamardashvili, the whole world of understanding as they understood the world, is gone. We cannot teach anybody, and in their school amongst other places, unless if I may put it this way, why is it that Madame La Lumière suddenly decided to believe 27 years ago into this project, which we are all of us taking part in? Why is it that Solomon Ginsburg, sitting over there, the politician and a citizen alone, he is doing it on behalf of all of us, and all in Kaliningrad regions and others are doing perfectly well there, doing fine there. I'm saying this because I don't know the answer to this question, but what I want to say is this: to turn it all into a flow of trainings, to turn it all into these mutual reports on how we do it, what is the best practice, means lose the touch with what is going on in reality, and as we fail to understand that we are standing where we are beyond the choice. This is actually very precisely put. We are standing here, whereas our other foot is over the abyss. And we should live with this too. Thank you. In point of fact, our time is up. Do let us give a couple of words to our... Yes, there were some questions, but mostly they are in point of fact ideas on, as we continued our conversation. If you got something to say, I suppose you can take up the questions maybe privately at the sidelines. But if you have some couple of ideas, please share.
I think I really want to respond at least to 2 or 3 points. I myself thought I was the devil in the room. It's really the question, who is the devil? Because I'm surrounded by this pessimistic look on Russia and by the withdrawal of Western partners who say there's no more гражданское общество left. Who do you want to work with? So I am constantly trying to wake up people that there is so much alive. It's small, it's local, and it is never going to be mainstream, because then we have another Russia. But at this point, the future is in these little seeds, and I find it very interesting that this is now not the devil's message. Secondly, the right to passivity. I think it always exists, and this is all about choice and freedom. I mean, again, I'm surrounded by people who have this impulse and the necessity. This is not McDonald's activism. It is to somehow, как говорит, take the deeper messages, the deeper faults and lack of development in society, and find a new language and a new communication with society to change things. It's not about blind activism. Then these people should really go and sit and take a holiday and do something else until they feel restored in their energy to do something meaningful. It's only meaningful if it has a deeper relevance for society. And I mean, there is a colleague here from Kyrgyzstan. We spoke yesterday. You know how women are beginning to find a new language in Central Asia to address their issues. This is not blind activism. It's addressing a deep deficit in society, that the potential of female creativity is not used throughout Central Asia. And there is Zere, a young singer who is just doing a pop music video, but who is in a way waking up a generation not only of women but of men who look differently at their own world. There is a new project of young 20-year-old women trying to build a first microsatellite to launch into space in order to regain confidence for Kyrgyzstan as a technologically advanced society, which it was in the Soviet time. This is not blind activism to me. This is trying to get out of stagnation, out of passivity, in order to relink with development and change for a better future. And, well, I think I leave it at that, because these 2 points are really sorry.
Thank you. On the question of passivity, I think I would look at it as time out. I think we all need to contemplate and take time out to reflect, but let it not be a recipe for inertia, because after you take that time out, hopefully you've recharged your batteries and you can engage constructively and socially. I just wanted to mention one thing, which is that there is a phenomenon today of a global divergence in what the definition of values are. The World Values Survey shows this enormous cleavage growing very fast and very different between the societies of largely the West, but let's say the industrialized developed countries, to some extent including Russia, where you have a fairly high level of human development, good incomes, and very, very good education. And the least developed countries, the less developed countries, which are economically stagnant, their values are remaining very traditional. And the question here is to close the gap. And how do we close the gap? And the answer, to some extent, is to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals that have come out of a global consensus about what should be humankind's priorities over the next few years. And just on that, I would say, on the question of women's role, I think is fundamentally important, because if you look at the World Values Survey, you will see that the emancipative values are the things that bring us forward socially. Economic emancipation, social and political emancipation, personal emancipation. And when you see this in, let us say, the Islamic world, because the Islamic world, whether it's in Central Asia or the Middle East or elsewhere, is to some extent stagnating. Not necessarily in every sense economically, because some of those countries are doing very well, but certainly it is stagnating culturally to some extent. There's very little that gets translated into Arabic from the outside world. And just as there may not be that much that gets translated into Russian from the outside world, and maybe then there are the questions of language and lexicon. But to the extent that there is a movement forward, it is the women in the Islamic world who are moving faster. And they're faster than the men. It comes back a little bit to, I think, what we were talking about yesterday, the white male being the more conservative and perhaps the more aggressive in many respects. So I think female emancipation and participation and leadership in the world is crucial for human sustainability, for social sustainability in any sphere, including environment.
Активизм не советская армия. Ни по повестке, ни по принуждению. Если вы просто честный человек, приличный, ну и будьте им. Молодежь не является моим фаворитом, уж извините. Я вообще-то, мне интереснее люди постарше, им больше есть что сказать. И вообще, если исходить из опыта мемориала, самые отличные волонтеры – это люди от 50 и старше. Насчет сделать понятным, это действительно важный просто вопрос, о котором мы много думаем, и как нам кажется, вот это этот школьный конкурс, о котором я говорила, это как раз и есть один, просто, может быть, очень скромный, но некоторый пример того, как попробовать говорить другим языком, потому что я думаю, что если вы попробуете предложить людям подумать о судьбе собственной семьи, особенно о судьбе семьи вот в 20 веке и семьи из бывшего СССР, то вы мимо понятия права человека просто не пройдете. Ну и последнее, да, и что я хотела бы обратить ваше внимание, что...
I would like to draw your attention that it's been 10 years ago that the first in Perm, our colleagues had a good progress project that included both the study and working with focus groups and came up with written and published recommendations about this new language. This might be of help to you. And the last point I wish to make, it's about this future that seems to be coming but seems never to be there, but it is there. But if you come to the memorial, then they come up with, I don't know, we had 3 principles. First of all, don't let anybody kill you. That's it, as simple as that. Never, as you don't allow you to be killed, never violate your principles. And thirdly, as you don't want and don't allow anybody to kill yourself and you are faithful to your principles, you do everyday work, down to earth, everyday work. When you work with people, Arseny Roginsky formulated these principles. Yes, a great epoch, a great world is gone now. Awfully sorry, it's off the mic. As I speak about Arseny today, on the 18th it will be a year since he's gone. One person alone, together with his organization, inspired the whole post-Soviet space that memory is a great thing, it's a political thing, it's a civic thing, and that the memorial is important as an organization. It is he who brought Putin, it was Arseny, yes, into Katyn and stood next to him. It was he who brought Putin to open the monument, although Putin never finished the work and never said that what has been committed, as Arseny said, this is the crime, the state crime. This is the work that needs to be done in the future. So this is done by one person alone, of course together supported by his organization, and that has been fully supportive of his idea. And he dedicated his life to this cause. It's so much in simple words about one person alone. I'm very thankful to Yulia Galyamina for raising the question about making the dividing line between civil activity and politics. It's indeed a grave mistake, bad mistake, and it's quite a danger about those politicians who require that, even when they commit crimes. Because in separating the civic will and civil activity, who are willing to interfere into the life of society, it is impossible to make a dividing line from politics, because politics about policy. This is about a city, a state, about a community, about how we live together. And to do it artificially, it's not only in interest of preserving the power, so that nobody should interfere, so that I am a rich president, an almighty president, with my very near dear, we want to keep what we've got, especially if all of a sudden I perish, I will be charged and tried. Well, I understand it's an important challenge, and would also remind to the civic activists who say we don't do politics. I understand that in Russian reality, this means people have to be protected from persecution, from the law, about foreign agents and you name it. But this idea that you want to meddle where you are not wanted to interfere. And I perceive it as a tactical step and I recognize that, but I suppose this also is part of self-awareness, and you don't really understand that it's an artificial dilemma. Then indeed it becomes dangerous and it's really quite a dead end. And if we're speaking about Arseny Roginsky, I had this discussion with him as 2012. As they adopted this law on foreign agents, we were in Perm right then, where this museum complex, they just took off this 1/3 of it, where you could remember and pay respect where it just happened. And at that time he thought maybe we should follow the channels that are open to us, where they prescribed to us. But it turned otherwise, and we saw it all happen. We saw the memorial that never went into just, what do you mean only its publications and whatever it did. They perceive it just as there is a supreme organization that also has political sense and political objectives. Yes, we can speak about this, but they can't. Only through just personal convictions. And this is also a matter of principle. I also would like to say that my colleagues from Ukraine, we don't have the right to be passive, to remain passive. Indeed, I deny this, but it might be wrong, but because we've got Trump, given that we have a war between Russia and Ukraine, given that we have immigration flows, and that hundreds of challenges, we're speaking about the most outstanding of them. I don't know where you can get the right to be passive, to remain passive. I understand the right to reflection, but we need it as a necessary step for activity. And yes, this needs to be done, but at that, yes, it's the last point I wish to make about trainings and conformism among the youth. I absolutely am no fan in seeing bright future only among the youth. It's ridiculous. Not because just 6, 12 or whoever, how many percent. No, it's because if we don't mobilize the society at large, we won't do anything. And this is done through, on average, people, older age people, they say, oh, nothing more just lies. You have no future, you are no longer responsible. We rely upon those who would be just doing things in 20 years' time and who would be managing things in 20 years' time. This is something that is really taking away a chance to work and work with all. But the very word training is, well, I think it's idiotic, but it's still good reason. It's still good reason so that you should really work on people's minds. You should try to understand. You should try to contemplate things. Think over things. You can give different names like workshop or you name it. But the most important thing is to still think what needs to be done. How do you need to do it? Why do you need to do it? And then after that you need to do it, right? There are people who love coffee and there are others who love Nescafe. So much about politics and civil society. Can you have 3 in 1? Oh yes, you can, but in principle, politics is about struggling to come to power, whereas civil society is fighting to ensure rules of the game, fight for the common good. Is it compatible? Oh yes, at times. If we speak about an orchestra, I would rather put it this way, that you don't need politicians in our orchestra, but let's run a festival where we'll perform classical music and, for example, just jazz. But the problem is that I've seen many events, and I took part in them, which were attended both by politicians and by civil society. When classical music is performed, as I was saying, all the snobs, they're also just sitting listening. Because when you hear jazz performed, it's a somewhat different. Not one single politician I can see him her present. It's very bad. But if we speak about promoting only to this top-down approach, then this is bad. There's so much about, but overall, I suppose the cooperation should be there. But I just hope that politicians should listen to something that what the civil society has to say. Well, I'm not sure that I was well understood. They understood me really well when I'm actually optimistic about the future of Russia. I recently wrote an article that Russia is changing. Russia has been changing, but we have a different audience here. I don't suppose we need to, the longer it takes, this sort of situation where whatever you say, it's all wonderful, it's there, and I'm very happy about this. And I believe in good future, but what I fear is that there is philosopher Baudrillard who wrote about simulacre. This is a very important topic about like make-believe things. When we speak about the future, when you pretend like the horizon goes away, and this is where all the danger lies. If we all here like we are speaking about human rights and whatever, this is bad. If we make conclusions and we come home and do something about this, and this is about passivity. I'm a hybrid person. It's not a very popular word right now, but I used to be in a think tank industry also. I'm teaching at university. I'm also a very active citizen of my country. And as I was saying, you were speaking about Nescafe. Yes, I've got this sort of Nescafe thing. And I'm trying in some way to do both. But the problem is about responsibility is always there. I see regrettably too much in international organizations as well as in when a friend of mine from Varshan, who works at a very tough, very international human rights, she says, I never believed that Russia would ever become a democratic country. And I say, what are you doing then in this? Why are you there? Do you just get a good pay for what you do? This is where my frustration lies. I can't believe this. Too much imitation in civil society and whatever. That's what I'm saying. You must leave the comfort zone and you should just push your boundaries. And when I say nobody believes and say, oh, look, young people, they are somewhat. When I speak about international implementary donors, human rights activists, had a meeting in June. I just raised my arm and said, who goes for, I'm sorry, something like case. There are a dozen of guys in Ukraine who don't have foreign passports, who can realistically maybe threatening torture in the country. Oh, it's not our mandate. This is human rights activists who say so. And this is where I want to pause.